Good morning. You are almost in the final steps of developing your paper. I want to say first that I'm very proud of the work that you've done. I know it's been rigorous and hard, and you've put in a lot of time and effort. Please make sure that these final steps are done correctly and the nuances of MLA, setting up your cover page, spacing, all of that. Don't forget, you don't want to lose silly formatting points for Comp 3 after all the work that you've put in. So, normally, when you write a paper, you create an MLA header. For this paper, you're actually going to create a cover page in MLA format. And this idea, if you decide to go on to post-secondary education and you're required to write an MLA, these standards are the most current, up-to-date MLA formatting standards. I always recommend, though, asking your professor what version they're using and then creating the nuances accordingly. All right, so step one, I'm going to share excerpts from work that I've actually done on my own writing. So, this whole paper that I'm giving an example of are chunks and pieces from my full thesis. So, they're not going to make sense if you read it as a whole. But the chunks and pieces are meant to give you a model for how to set up parts of your paper and hopefully give you a visual perspective of how to do it correctly. All right, so the first thing you're going to do is you're going to set up your page numbering. Now, in Google, what you choose is you go to insert and you go to header and page number, and then you go to page number and you choose the first option that appears. And what's going to happen is it's going to put up page numbers, and there's going to be a little box here that says different first page. Please check that because in MLA formatting, you do not number the first page. So you just delete that. If the one appears, you just delete it and it goes away. And that way, that will be blank. Then, if you go on to page 2, you're going to notice that the numbering appears on the right hand side, and you're going to type your name in front of that number. And if you've done it correctly, every page that you go on to should then have the last name with the next number of page. So that's the first step. Now you're ready to set up your cover page. Once your header and your page numbering is done, you just click out of it and it should disappear. So the first thing you're actually going to do, which is something a little different than I think you normally do when you write in social studies and English, is you actually on an MLA paper, the first thing you put on your cover page is the name of the institution. So in this case, you're going to put Guilford High School, but you're going to notice that I didn't start at the very top. I actually hit enter twice and then I type Guilford High School. As I do that, though, immediately after, make sure to set your spacing to double spacing because when you start hitting enter after that, you're going to hit so many times before you start typing your title. If you don't set double spacing, it's going to be too close and it's not going to fill the full page. So after you hit enter twice and put the name of your high school, you're then going to hit enter, I would say approximately 5 times. And I'll put that in the comment strand. And that should bring you down to being able to create your title. Now, your goal here is to create a title that is relevant to whatever your topic is. So mine was about World War I propaganda. So my title for my writing was World War I Propaganda in Perspective, A Lack of Recognition. And that has to do with the ideology of what I focused my thesis on. So look at your thesis and try to come up with a clever kind of, it doesn't want to be like, it's not a fictional novel, but it should be something that draws interest in someone reading the title and wanting to know more. Okay. After you type the title, you'll notice that every word is capitalized except for the word in. I put a colon, so the word a is going to be capitalized here, but normally your articles are not capitalized, and unless it starts the beginning of the sentence. Then you're going to hit enter 10 times. I know this is silly and counting seems kind of strange, but it is MLA formatting, and we're practicing that as a skill. So once you get down to 10 times, you're going to do the header that you're probably familiar with. You're going to type your first and last name. You're going to type your class. If it's a college paper, you would actually type the course name with the course number. But since this is just US history, you can put whatever block you're in. I don't need that. You can just put the name of the course. Then you're going to put my name, which is Ms. Barksdale, and you're going to put the date that the paper is due, which is June 2nd, 2019. And that will fulfill your cover page for this paper. All right. So now you're going to start going into your parts. There are going to be 4 parts to this paper, and then your bibliography will be at the very end. It's very important that you label each part. Normally, if you're writing a really, really long paper, you might even have a table of contents and it will tell the reader what pages that each part starts into. We're not going to do that for this version, but you're going to notice that I've labeled my first part introduction. So I have a little comment strand over here to remind you. Part 1 should be introduction, part 2 should be historical evolution, part 3 should be thesis defense, and part 4 should be titled conclusion. Very important to note, and this is something a little different than what you normally do when you write with us, if it's like a writing prompt. Your thesis should not be stated until the very end of part 2. So part 1, your introduction, should not mention your thesis. It will allude to your thesis, but not mention it. All right. So the first paragraph of your introduction should hook the reader into your topic. You can provide a quote, you can provide a statistical study. It's something that kind of draws the reader in. The second part of this section should define the major terms of your thesis. And if you did your outline correctly, you've been defining all those major terms. Now, here's the thing. It shouldn't read like a list. So you want to add in transitional words and phrases, statements in between, so that it flows nicely as a writing piece as opposed to a list of definitions. Finally, for part 1, you're going to put that quote, case study, or statistic to bring relevance to the thesis. And I gave you my example as a quote that kind of brought me into why I'm studying this particular topic, which is my goal with my thesis was to place women in history and provide an angle of groups of people that have often been overlooked in their support and help of history. So I have a quote from a historian that I really like, which is Gerda Lerner. And I mentioned a quote that she stated that kind of draws into why I'm researching this. And many of you have found a statistic, a study, whatever. I'll encourage you here. Some of you had like 17 relevant things that you found. You want to narrow it down to 1 or 2. Your introduction should not be overly long. It should be at most 1 to 2 pages. And for some of you, you put a lot of stuff into your intro. And I didn't critique you in a negative way there, but I will say in this case, this is where you need to kind of pan out what you think are the most relevant and put that into your intro. You don't want to overwhelm your reader with like 7 pages of an introduction because they're going to lose sight of what it is you're arguing. So if you have like 17 case studies for your introduction, for your outline, narrow it down to the top 2, the 2 that you think are the most relevant to why your topic should be researched. Notice that I put a note here. Do not state your thesis at the end of part 1. This is very weird, I know, but trust me on this one. The goal of part 1 is you're introducing your topic to the reader. Now, your professors, if you decide to go into college, may say, I want you to get to the point faster. They may ask for your thesis in your introduction. Ask what kind of paper it is you're writing, and know that you have to change per whatever instructor you have. There's always small nuances, and that's part of human nature. All right. So strangely, the end of part 1 actually ends at the end of this page. But if it didn't, and I still had a ton of page left, I would hit enter until I got to a new page to start part 2. So when you're about to start a new section, you need to go to the new page. Even if you've only filled like 3 lines of this page and you have all this empty space left, you still need to hit enter to go to a brand new page to start your next section. You should not start part 2 in the middle of a page. It should start on its own brand new page. You'll notice that I've centered it. Everything I've written in is Times New Roman 12 point, and you're going to notice there is no extra spacing in my paper. So even between the title and starting the new paragraph, please do not put extra spacing. And I've labeled it historical evolution. So this is where you need to take those 5 points in history and you need to turn and craft them into kind of well-developed sentences and thought. This is very much a continuation, like a continuity transitions where it's almost like first, second, and third. Obviously, I don't want you to put those types of transitions in. I expect you to be a little more sophisticated in your transition development, but this should read very carefully like, in April of 18 of this happened, and you're kind of leading the reader to what your thesis is about. So I gave you a little taste of mine. And my first historical checkpoint was actually kind of giving background to World War I. So the idea of like Wilson as president and World War I progressing. And I talk about the creation of the CPI. Mine may not fit completely in context with what you're doing, but the goal is you're going to take those 5 sentences you've created and you're going to put them into a historical evolution. It doesn't have to be 5 separate paragraphs. You might tie a couple into the same paragraph with some word flow as you go. I will stress to you this. You're going to notice that all of my facts, whether they're quoted or paraphrased, have an in-text citation. MLA format should have the period at the end of the parentheses. If it's the title, it should be in quotation marks if it's the title of an article. If it's a book, and it has an author, it should be the author's last name and the page number. And you're going to notice there's no comma unless I have multiple authors. So if it was like Greg Smith, Johns, and if it's and, you actually put the ampersand and you put Strelsberg. I just made that name up. And once again, you put the page number, no comma, and a period. If I use this book again for a citation, the next time I use the citation, I would not list all of the authors again. I would list the first one and I would put Greg et al. And then put the page number. That is only done the second time that if you use a source again and it has like 17 authors. The first time you list all 17 authors, the second time you put et al. And that tells the reader that you're using the same source again. And it also is a shortcut so you don't have to keep listing the authors. Okay? So the historical evolution, and then at the very end of your historical evolution, you should state your thesis. Now, my thesis is longer than yours because my thesis encompassed a massive paper. Your thesis statement will probably just be one sentence, maybe two. The point of a thesis is it should get to the point as quickly as possible. And through mine, I'm encompassing a much broader topic. Yours is probably only going to be one sentence, and that's okay. What you will notice though, and this is a little weird, you're going to bold your thesis. And this will actually drive everything that you're doing for part 3. And so if the reader was wondering, like, what is it they're clearly arguing, your thesis should be bolded, and you're allowed to actually do that. Now, if your professor tells you not to do that, once again, listen to what they say. But in a normal paper, in a massive research paper, you should actually bold your thesis. So you can use some narration. So I say, thus the research asserts, and then I go on to name my thesis. So you can actually use some words like my findings show. Don't say my, but you could say the findings show, and then you can state the thesis statement. So once again, state it, one sentence, bold it, and then you should be going on to part 3. The very last thing of part 2 should be your thesis. Nothing should come after it. And you'll notice that I have a huge page gap here, but I'm not going to start part 3 on this page. I'm going to enter all the way down to a new page, and I'm going to start my paper there. And I think this needs to be double spaced. And I'll say part 3, thesis defense. Now, I've given you an example for this page of my thesis defense with one of my pieces of evidence. And you're going to notice that the first 2 paragraphs are actually an annotated bibliography that I created on an author, Lynn Dumniel, whose book I used as part of my defense for my thesis. So you're going to notice I give a little ethos to who she is. I give a little background to the types of books that she's written. I talk about how she's going to fit into this topic, and then I go on to mention what the specs actually is. So the 2 paragraphs that I have before I even give my specs is the annotated bibliography that you created. So every piece of evidence for part 3 that you found, you should start with the annotated bib, and then you should go into the specs. Now, for your annotated bib, it should have been in alphabetical order. For this, it doesn't have to be. You can go in any order that you want with your specs. That will help fit whatever it is you're researching. So I started with annotated bib. You'll notice that this takes a couple paragraphs. Yours will probably be 1 paragraph, which is totally fine. Mine happened to take up 2. And then I go on to give the specs. And what's really important is that some of my information, I didn't have a quote, I paraphrased. But even if I'm paraphrasing, I need to have an in-text citation. If you took an idea from the source, if it's like something that's leading into your specs, if you need to give a little background, it doesn't matter. If you got the idea from the source, please put that in-text citation. So you'll notice that I have no quote here, but I actually have an in-text citation because I got the idea from her book. Then I go on to talk about what she talks about in the chapter. And once again, I don't use a direct quote, but I still have to cite what she said because these ideas are not my own. From that point on, I go on to give a little quote that I believe will defend my thesis, and I give an analysis that explains how it defends my thesis. Now, what's really important, when you're introducing your specific example, you can actually use like Dumniel states this from the book, she explains this. So you can actually do a little bit of narration of first person narration to be able to describe what it is you're talking about. And then you give the quote. Once again, no punctuation at the end of the quote. It should go at the end of the parentheses. My analysis here is a little short. I would encourage that your analysis statement is 1 to 2 sentences. And remember, the purpose of an analysis is to look at the specs and explain how it supports the thesis that you bolded in part 2. So I always go back and I scroll up to part 2 and I say, okay, what is it I'm defending? And how am I going to explain that this fact that I'm talking about defends that argument? And that's really the core of what your analysis is trying to do. It's almost like you're saying to the reader, here's my evidence. And your analysis says, okay, here's how my evidence proves my argument correct. And that's one of the most crucial pieces, especially for Comp 1. All right, so I hope that helps with the setup. You're going to notice again, I have extra spacing. So I hit enter down to part 4, which is my conclusion. And I label it part 4 conclusion centered. And then I go over. One thing I didn't mention in the earlier sections, for each new paragraph, just hit tab once. That's it. And then if you have in between paragraphs, you should have no extra spacing. So just bear that in mind. Even if you are switching like specs evidence, you should have no extra spacing between them. All right. So for part 4 conclusion, your conclusion should do 3 things. The first is it should remind the reader of main points of the paper. So I gave you some examples that actually show that. So once again, you should remind the reader of the main points that you're talking about. So I gave some examples from mine. It's not a full conclusion, so it might read a little choppy, but I've included some of the main ideas of what my capstone actually talked about. Finally, the last 2 pieces. 1, you should have a paragraph that talks about new avenues of research. And if you read mine, I don't just state the new avenues of research. I remind the reader of what it is I argued and then how further research could build off of that. So you're almost doing a restatement of your thesis idea, and then you're building for how future research could examine different points from the areas that you looked at. And I even draw back to some evidence that I mentioned when I refer to new avenues of research to tell the reader, like, this study can also be used for this. So don't just say, like, people can learn about how animals are going to become extinct because of pollution. You should almost draw back to the evidence you have, like, this study could also be used for this. So you want to build a little bit and reminding the reader of what it is you argued and why your evidence was relevant and how your evidence could possibly be used in other capacities for later research from the one that you did. Because the goal of all research is that it should be relevant and should push something forward. Research is never definitively done. So the idea is you're almost saying, like, here's some new paths that can be taken. And then finally, you should have a small paragraph, and you're going to notice mine is very short. This is actually the last paragraph of my work. And it's just a closing thought on the topic as a whole. I shouldn't introduce new arguments here. It might be 1 sentence, which is strange, I know, to write as a paragraph, but it's really kind of just telling the reader, finally, 1 to 2 sentences, what is my closing thought about why this whole topic is important? And it really comes full circle back to the first paragraph. I sometimes will refer back to my very first paragraph of what I tried to hook the reader with, and I will almost try to bring it full circle by saying, like, here's my hook. Here was the thing I said that mattered to you, and now I've proven the point that I'm trying to make. All right. So I hope that helps you. Some nuanced things. It should be all double spaced. Tab in for each new paragraph. Make sure you have in-text citations for both direct quotes and paraphrasing. Some of you get confused by that. Even if you don't have a direct quote and it comes from another source and not your brain, it should still have an in-text citation. So don't forget that. Each new part should start on a new page. You should have a cover page at the very beginning, and you should only have no extra spacing. So I notice right here I have an extra spacing, and I just need to make sure that that's double spaced. And you should number your pages except for the first one. All right, good luck. I know this is long, but I hope it helps you be able to prepare a good paper. Let me know if you have any questions. Just a reminder, your optional rough draft is due by midnight on Monday, and your final draft is due June 2nd by midnight. Good luck.